September 7th, 1940, London. The late afternoon sun hung low over the industrial heart of the East. It was 4 p.m. when the first tremors of a new kind of war began to shake the city. For months, the people of Britain had watched the skies, listening to news of the Royal Air Force locked in a desperate struggle against the Luftwaffe over the English Channel. They had seen the dogfights in the distance, but the capital itself had remained a spectator to the violence that changed in an instant. As the clock struck 4:30 p.m., a massive formation of nearly 350 German bombers, escorted by over 600 fighter planes, crossed the coast and followed the winding silver ribbon of the River Thames toward the heart of the British Empire. This was the beginning of what history would remember as Black Saturday. The target was not the airfields of Kent or the radar stations of the coast, but the densely populated neighborhoods of the docklands. These were the neighborhoods of the working class, where families lived in rows of small terraced houses squeezed between the massive warehouses that fueled the city's trade. When the first sticks of incendiary bombs began to fall at 5 p.m., the world seemed to turn into a furnace. The Luftwaffe's aim was precise and devastating. They targeted the stores of the Royal Victoria and Albert Docks, the West India Docks, and the Surrey Commercial Docks. Within minutes, huge stockpiles of sugar, grain, timber, and rubber were engulfed in flames. The heat was so intense that it created its own weather system. Firefighters, many of them volunteers with little experience in such a cataclysm, described the sound as a roaring gale. In the Silvertown district, the fires were so fierce that the paint on the fire engines began to blister and peel. The river itself appeared to be boiling as barrels of rum and oil burst, pouring liquid fire onto the water. By 6 p.m., a massive column of black smoke rose miles into the air, a dark pillar that could be seen by German pilots still crossing the French coast. The first wave had done its job, leaving behind a city in shock and a skyline dominated by a hellish orange glow. As the sun set, the true terror of the new strategy became clear. In earlier weeks, the raids had ebbed with the daylight, but as night fell on September 7, the hum of engines returned. The Luftwaffe did not need advanced navigation to find their targets this time. The fires of the afternoon acted as a beacon, visible for 60 miles in every direction. From 8 p.m. until the following morning, the bombing was relentless. This was the dawn of the Night Blitz, a campaign of psychological and physical attrition designed to break the will of the British people. Families huddled in Anderson shelters in their back gardens or crowded into the damp, cramped stations of the London Underground. Every explosion felt like the of the world. Above ground, the air was thick with the smell of pulverized brick, charred wood, and the metallic tang of high explosives. When the all-clear siren finally sounded at 5 a.m., the following morning, the people of London emerged to a landscape they no longer recognized. More than 400 civilians had been killed in a single night, and thousands more were left homeless, their lives reduced to the few belongings they could carry in a suitcase. Yet, amidst the devastation of Black Saturday, something unexpected began to stir. Instead of the mass panic and furor that the German High Command had predicted, there was a quiet, grim resilience. In the shadow of smoking ruins, neighbors who had never spoken before began to help one another dig through the rubble. Mobile canteens appeared, serving hot tea to weary rescuers. This was the birth of the Blitz Spirit, a collective refusal to be intimidated by the fire from above. The legacy of those first raids is not just found in the casualty lists or the architectural scars that still mark London today. It is found in the memory of a city that refused to stop beating. The fire was meant to be the funeral pyre of a nation, but it became the forge where a new sense of unity was hammered into existence. We look back at the silhouettes of the firefighters against the crimson sky, and the families sharing bread in the wreckage, and we see a profound testament to the human soul. They prove that while an enemy can destroy a street, they cannot destroy the heart of a people who decide, in the face of absolute darkness, to simply carry on. September 7th, 1940, over the winding waters of the River Thames, the horizon did not fade into a peaceful dusk, but instead ignited in a terrifying wall of fire. This was the moment the character of the war changed for every man, woman, and child in the capital. As the clock struck 5 p.m., the first wave of over 300 German bombers crested the coast, their shadows stretching long over the east docks. It was a Saturday afternoon that began with the mundane rhythms of week life, only to be shattered by the haunting, rising and falling wail of the air raid sirens. For many, this was the sound of the world. The target was clear, the lifeblood of the British Empire's trade. The docklands, packed with sugar, grain, and timber, became a tinderbox. By 6 p.m., the sky was no longer blue or gray, but a bruised, pulsating orange. The sheer scale of the destruction was unprecedented. Warehouses packed with flammable goods erupted with such intensity that the heat could be felt miles away. In Silvertown, residents found themselves trapped by a ring of fire, the very air seemingly sucked out of their lungs as the inferno fed on everything in its path. But this was only the prelude. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Luftwaffe returned, guided not by radar or complex navigation, but by the massive beacon of the burning city itself. At 8 p.m., the nightly bombardment began in earnest, a relentless cycle of high explosives and incendiaries designed to break the will of the populace. The ground trembled with a rhythmic violence that felt eternal. In the cramped, damp confines of the Anderson shelters, or the terrifying exposure of a brick surface shelter, families huddled together, listening to the whistle of falling metal and the thunderous crump of buildings collapsing into dust. By 11 p.m., London was a landscape of silhouettes. Firemen, many of them volunteers with little more than a brass helmet and a canvas hose, stood against walls of flame that reached 100 feet into the air. They fought a losing battle against the firestorms, phenomena where the heat was so intense it created its own weather systems, pulling debris and even people into the vortex of the flames. Water pressure failed as the mains were ruptured, forcing crews to pump directly from the Thames, their hoses snaking through streets littered with glass that crunched like winter frost under their boots. The psychological toll of those first few nights cannot be measured in statistics alone. It was the smell of scorched earth and old brick dust that lingered in the nostrils long after the sun rose. It was the sight of a neighbor's house vanished, replaced by a jagged hole in the earth. At 3 a.m., during the deepest hours of the raids, the darkness was punctuated by the rhythmic thud of anti-aircraft guns, a defiant but often ineffective response to the unseen predators circling above. Yet, amidst this mechanical terror, a strange new normalcy began to take root. People found that they were still standing. They shared thermoses of tea in the middle of the night, whispered jokes to drown out the sounds of the bombs, and looked at the stranger next to them with a sudden, piercing recognition of shared fate. As we look back at those nights when the city seemed destined to crumble into ash, we find more than just a tale of survival. We find the legacy of a city that refused to be defined by what was taken from it. The initial terror of the nightly bombardment did not lead to the expected collapse of social order. Instead, it stripped away the superficial layers of class and station, leaving behind a raw, hardened core of human urines. The fires of 1940 burnt away the old London, and in the heat of that destruction, forged a collective identity that remains etched into the very stones of the city today. We see it in the quiet dignity of the memorials and the persistent rhythm of a metropolis that knows its own strength. The Blitz was intended to be a message of despair sent from the sky, but the response from the ground was a far more powerful statement of hope. It remains a testament to the fact that light does not just exist in the absence of darkness. Sometimes, it is the fire we carry within us that keeps the shadows at bay. September 7, 1940, in the humid, tiled depths of London's underground stations, a new kind of civilization began to take root. As the sun dipped below the horizon at 7 p.m., and the sirens wailed their mournful warning, thousands of Londoners didn't just hide, they migrated. Initially, the British government had strictly forbidden the use of tube stations as bomb shelters, fearing that a deep shelter mentality would take hold and sap the nation's will to work or fight. They worried that once people went down, they might never come back up. But the logic of the bureaucracy stood no chance against the sheer necessity of survival. Londoners bought their three-penny tickets, walked onto the platforms, and simply stayed. By the time the clock struck 8 p.m. on those first nights of the Blitz, the platforms were already carpeted with humanity. This was not merely a collection of frightened individuals waiting for it was the birth of a subterranean society. By 9:15 p.m. on any given night during the height of the bombing, the stations were alive with a hum that defied the explosions rocking the earth above. There was the rhythmic clatter of knitting needles, the low murmur of gossip, and the constant, comforting whistle of tea kettles. The government eventually recognized the inevitable, installing thousands of triple-tiered bunks and organizing medical clinics and even libraries among the tracks. In the tunnels of Elephant and Castle, or the deep shafts of Hampstead, the class barriers that had long defined British life began to thin. A dock worker from the east might find himself sharing a thermos of tea with a bank clerk from the city, both of them huddled together on a cold stone floor as the dust drifted down from the ceiling with every distant thud. The environment was punishing. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, tobacco smoke, and the unwashed bodies of thousands. Yet, within this claustrophobic world, there was a strange, defiant joy. Volunteer shelter marshals organized concerts and sing-alongs. You could walk through the station at 10 p.m. and hear a chorus of hundreds singing the Lambeth Walk or It's a Long Way to Tipperary, their voices echoing through the tunnels to drown out the sound of the Luftwaffe overhead. For many children, the tube was an adventure, a place where the rules of bedtime were suspended and where the community became an extended family. They slept in hammocks slung over the tracks or huddled in the luggage racks of parked trains. Despite the sense of safety, the underground was not invincible. On the night of October 14th, 1940, at 8:02 p.m., a heavy, high-explosive bomb hit the road surface above Balham Station, causing the tunnel to collapse and a water main to burst. It was a harrowing reminder that even 60 feet below the street, no one was truly beyond the reach of the war. But the tragedy did not break the spirit of the tube dwellers. The very next evening, the crowds returned. They had found something in the darkness that the bombs could not destroy, a profound sense of mutual reliance. They shared their meager rations, looked after each other's children, and kept the morale of a city alive through the sheer force of their presence. When the all-clear finally sounded at 5:30 a.m., a weary, soot-stained army would rise from the platforms. They would fold their blankets, pack their small suitcases, and it's the long escalators to see what was left of their streets. They often emerged to find buildings turned to rubble and fires still smoldering, but they stepped out into the morning light with their heads held high. They had survived another night, not just as individuals, but as a collective. This subterranean strength became the bedrock of London's legacy. It was in these tunnels that the concept of the Blitz Spirit was forged, not as a propaganda slogan, but as a lived reality of kindness under pressure. The tube shelters proved that when a people are stripped of their homes and their safety, they do not necessarily descend into chaos. Instead, they reach for one another. This period of history reminds us that the true architecture of a city isn't found in its skyscrapers or its monuments, but in the invisible bonds formed between strangers in the dark. It is a legacy of resilience that suggests our greatest protection in times of crisis is not the concrete above our heads, but the compassion we show to the person sitting next to us on the floor. Even in the deepest shadows, the human heart has a way of generating its own warmth, turning a cold transit tunnel into a sanctuary of hope that no bomb could ever penetrate. September 8, 1940, in the heart of London, the sun rose over a horizon that had been rewritten by fire. The night's bombardment had been relentless, leaving the air thick with the acrid scent of pulverized brick, charred timber, and the escaping hiss of broken gas mains. To an outsider, the city might have looked defeated, a sprawling ruin of twisted metal and hollowed-out monuments. But as the clock struck 7 a.m., something remarkable began to happen. The sirens had fallen silent, but the city did not remain still. Instead, the people of London began the grueling, quiet work of reclaiming their lives from the wreckage. This was not a military maneuver or a grand political gesture. but a million tiny acts of individual defiance that proved the Luftwaffe could destroy buildings, but they could not destroy a society. The milkman was often the first symbol of this resilience. By 8 a.m., despite the craters that had swallowed entire intersections, the familiar clink of glass bottles echoed through the soot-stained streets. These men did not wait for the debris to be cleared. They climbed over mounds of jagged masonry and balanced on the edges of bomb sites just to place a pint of milk on a doorstep that sometimes no longer had a house behind it. It was a signal to the neighborhood that the world was still turning, that the morning routine was sacred, and that the enemy had failed to stop the clock. By 9 a.m., the sound of brooms hitting the pavement became the city's new anthem. Shopkeepers, many of whom had spent the night in damp shelters, arrived at their businesses to find their windows blown out and their stock covered in a fine layer of gray dust. Without a word of complaint, they began to sweep. They cleared the glass into neat piles and hung hand-lettered signs over the gaping holes where their storefronts used to be. Some signs simply read, "Open as usual," while others, leaning into the dry wit that sustained the city, claimed they were more open than usual. This humor was a weapon. It stripped the terror from the attacks and replaced it with a shared, stubborn pride. The commute to work became a daily expedition into the unknown. If a direct hit had severed a tube line or blocked a primary road, Londoners simply adapted. At 10 a.m., crowds could be seen walking miles across the city, navigating around the ropes of the bomb disposal squads who were working to defuse unexploded ordnance. There was no panic, only a grim, quiet determination to reach the office or the factory. On the buses, conductors kept up a steady stream of chatter, helping passengers navigate the changing landscape of their own hometown. To stay at home was seen as a surrender, and in the daylight, Londoners were determined to show they were anything but defeated. As 1 p.m. approached, the ritual of the queue became a testament to the city's discipline. People stood in long, orderly lines for bread, meat, or a hot meal from a communal kitchen. Even when the air raid sirens wailed their midday warning, many stayed in line, looking at the sky with more annoyance than fear. They had learned to judge the danger by the sound of the engines and the direction of the wind. In the factories, where the production of Spitfires and ammunition never ceased, women worked 12-hour shifts under corrugated iron roofs. At 2:30 p.m., when the spotters on the rooftops blew their whistles to signal imminent danger, the workers would duck briefly under their heavy machinery, only to resume their tasks the moment the immediate threat passed. The late afternoon brought its own challenges. By 4 p.m., the focus shifted to the evening ahead. Housewives navigated the rubble to find coal or firewood, while others began the process of preparing their homes for the nightly blackout. Yet, even in the face of such exhaustion, the spirit of community thrived. Neighbors who had barely spoken before the war now shared recipes for ration goods, or helped one another board up damaged roofs. The shared experience of the Blitz had dissolved the rigid class boundaries of the past, creating a new, unified identity forged in the dust of the streets. This daylight defiance was the ultimate failure of the German strategy. The goal of the Blitz was to break the morale of the British people, to drive them to the point of collapse so they would demand into the war. Instead, the daily life maintained amidst the rubble became a source of strength. The legacy of these hours is the realization that true heroism is often found in the most mundane actions. It is the understanding that when the world is falling apart, the most radical thing a person can do is continue. The image of a Londoner walking through the dust of their own street to go to work remains one of the most powerful symbols of the human spirit. It tells us that while darkness may fall and the earth may tremble, the light of human dignity is a flame that no amount of shadow can ever truly extinguish. It is a reminder that we are defined not by what we suffer, but by how we choose to stand when the smoke finally clears. London survived not just because of its tunnels and its guns, but because its people refused to let a single day pass without claiming it as their own. January 1, 1941, London. The new year arrived not with bells and celebrations, but with the haunting, rising pitch of the air raid sirens and the smell of stale soot hanging in the freezing air. By this point, the initial shock of the bombing had hardened into a grueling daily marathon of survival. The winter of 1941 was exceptionally bitter, with temperatures dropping so low that fire hoses froze solid and the Thames was choked with ice. For the millions of Londoners who descended into the depths of the earth each night, the war was no longer an event to be watched. It was a condition to be lived. At 6 p.m., as the early winter darkness swallowed the city, the exodus began. Families carried blankets, thermoses of tea, and small bags of valuables toward the underground stations. Down on the platforms, thousands of people lay shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and disinfectant. Above them, the city trembled. By 11 p.m., the Luftwaffe would often be over the city in force, dropping a lethal mix of high explosives to shatter buildings and incendiaries to ignite what remained. The psychological weight of this period cannot be overstated. It was the era of the long durance, a time when the adrenaline of the early raids had faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. On the night of January 11th, the city faced one of its most terrifying tests. A massive raid targeted the bank in the historic center of the capital. At 8 p.m., a bomb struck the central concourse of the bank underground station, killing over 50 people who thought they were safe deep underground. The crater was so vast that a temporary bridge had to be built across it, so the city could function the next day. Yet, even as the dead were being recovered at 3 a.m., the civil defense workers were already planning how to keep the city moving for the morning commute. This was the rhythm of life. Sleep deprivation became a collective illness. By 4 a.m., the anti-aircraft guns would still be thumping in the parks, their muzzle flashes illuminating the skeletal remains of Victorian terraces. The people were exhausted, yet a strange, defiant routine had taken hold. Milkmen still did their rounds at 7:30 a.m., stepping over piles of broken glass and weaving through fire hoses. Shopkeepers would sweep the debris from their doorsteps and hang signs that read, "More open than usual." The climax of this winter of fire came on the night of May 10, 1941. It was the heaviest raid of the entire Blitz. Over 500 German bombers crossed the coast, appearing over London at 11 p.m. and staying until the first light of dawn. That night, the House of Commons was destroyed. The British Museum was hit, and nearly 1,500 people were killed. At 2 a.m., the city looked like a vision of the world, with fires merging into a single roaring inferno. But as the sun rose at 5:45 a.m., the sirens fell silent for what would be the last major raid for years. The Luftwaffe was being moved east for the invasion of the Soviet Union. London had held. The legacy of these months is not found in the maps of destroyed neighborhoods or the statistics of casualties, but in the psychological transformation of a people. The Blitz failed in its primary objective because it did not break the British will to fight. Instead, it stripped away the barriers of class and geography, binding a city together in a shared experience of terror and triumph. It proved that a modern civilization could withstand the most concentrated technological violence of its age and emerge with its dignity intact. When we look back at the soot-stained faces of 1941, we see more than just victims of war. We see the architects of a resilience that continues to define our understanding of the human spirit. The ruins were eventually cleared, and the craters were filled with the foundations of a new world, but the echoes of those sirens still linger in the stones of the city. They serve as a permanent testament that even when the night is at its longest and the fire is at its hottest, there is something within the human heart that refuses to be consumed. The durance of London was the first great victory of the Second World War, a quiet, stubborn refusal to yield that changed the course of history forever. May 11, 1941, over the smoldering skyline of London, a strange and heavy silence finally began to descend upon the city. After nearly 9 months of relentless bombardment, the Luftwaffe had turned its sights toward the east, leaving behind a landscape that was physically shattered but spiritually unyielding. The fires of the previous night's raid, which was the most devastating of the entire campaign, were still being fought at 10 a.m. as the sun struggled to pierce through a thick shroud of soot and ash. For the millions who crawled out of their shelters and the basements of their ruined homes, the world had been irrevocably altered. They stood among the skeletal remains of their neighborhoods, not as victims of a superior force, but as survivors who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. This morning marked the beginning of a long, slow transition from survival to remembrance, and the birth of a legacy that would define the British identity for generations to come. As the years passed and the immediate threat of invasion faded, the task of reconstruction began in earnest. It was not merely about laying bricks or pouring concrete. It was about reclaiming the soul of a nation that had been tested by fire. By 3 p.m., on any given afternoon in the late 1940s, a passerby might see the first green saplings being planted in the deep craters of the east, or the scaffolding rising around the scorched but standing dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. The cathedral had become the ultimate symbol of this survival, a stone sentinel that remained standing while the world around it crumbled. This period of rebuilding was defined by a collective purpose that transcends social class. The shopkeeper and the aristocrat had shared the same damp tube stations and the same meager rations, and that shared vulnerability forged a bond of unity that would eventually underpin the creation of the modern welfare state. The Blitz Spirit was not just a propaganda tool. It was a lived reality of mutual aid born from the necessity of total war. Yet, the legacy of the Blitz is not just found in the monuments of stone and steel, but in the quiet, lingering scars of the people who earned it. There was an entire generation that could never hear a distant siren or the heavy rumble of a passing truck without a momentary tightening of the chest or a quick glance toward the sky. They carried the weight of those nights when the sky turned a bruised, unnatural purple and the ground shook with the rhythmic thud of high explosives. For those who lived through it, the war did not with a parade or a signature on a treaty. It ended when they could finally sleep through the night without the terror of never waking up. This psychological fortitude is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the era. It proved to the world that the civilian population was not a weakness to be exploited, but a fortress that could not be breached by fear alone. The resilience of the Londoner became a beacon for every city that has since faced the darkness of conflict. Today, if you walk through the streets of London at 6 p.m., you see a city that has gracefully swallowed its history. Modern glass towers and gleaming offices stand where the incendiaries once fell, and the bustling crowds move with a frantic energy that belies the stillness of the past. But if you look closer, the Blitz is everywhere. It is found in the uneven brickwork of a terrace house, the sudden, unexplained gap in a row of Victorian buildings, and the small, weathered memorial plaques that whisper the names of those who stood their ground. The city is a living museum of defiance. It serves as a permanent reminder that the character of a civilization is not measured by the height of its buildings or the strength of its currency, but by its capacity to ure the unurable. The story of the Blitz is a narrative of fire, but more importantly, it is a narrative of light. It taught the world that unity is not found in the absence of fear, but in the courage to face that fear together. As the sun sets over the Thames today, casting long shadows across the monuments of a hard-won peace, we must remember that the freedom we enjoy was bought with the stubbornness of those who refused to let their spirits be broken. Their voices may have faded into the annals of history, but their legacy remains etched into the very atmosphere of the city. It is a legacy that tells us that no matter how dark the clouds may gather, the human heart possesses an inextinguishable flame. In the ruins were not just the conclusion of an old world, but the sacred foundations of a new one. Built upon the ashes of terror by the hands of the brave, we are the inheritors of that courage, tasked with remembering that even in the darkest night, we are never truly alone as long as we stand together.